Welcome to the Irish Revolution. November 1920 is the turning point of the War of Independence. It marks a definitive shift in the conflict. Before the IRA were a bunch of criminals who needed to be put down by the police. After November, the British began to realise that they were fighting an insurgency. The shift is not just a matter of semantics. The British narrative of the paramilitary presence in Ireland in the form of the Black and Tans as a police action no longer held water in neither Britain nor the international press. The entire mechanism for describing the conflict had turned on its head. Although Ireland could have told them this month earlier, it was now clear that there was a war on the island. In 1921, the conflict would continue, but the peace feelers that were tentatively making their way to the Republicans made it clear that the British had no stomach for an all-out counter-insurgency campaign. And why was November 1920 the turning point of the war? There were two events in particular. One was Bloody Sunday, on the 21st November 1920. In the morning, a hand-picked group of IRA assassins killed 16 British intelligence officers, crippling the intelligence infrastructure of Crown forces in the capital and displaying the kind of sophisticated operation that the British hadn't believed the Irish were capable of. That evening, in retaliation, the auxiliaries and the RIC opened fire on an unarmed crowd in Crow Park, Dublin, killing 14 and wounding 60 in what would be regarded as the greatest atrocity in the entire conflict. The other event this month was the Kilmichael ambush in County Cork. A week after the dramatic events of Bloody Sunday, a column of seasoned IRA guerrilla fighters wiped out 17 auxiliaries in the largest single military confrontation since 1916. The scale of the carnage, as well as the sophistication of the attack itself, not to mention the political impact having taken place just a week after Bloody Sunday, made Prime Minister Lloyd George's earlier claim of having, quote, murder by the throat, unquote, laughably premature. Let's start with Bloody Sunday. We've spoken before at length on this channel about the intelligence war in Dublin, masterminded by Michael Collins and his squad of personal assassins. Collins, among others, correctly identified that any direct military conflict with Britain was doomed to failure. He also knew his history and his enemy. Few nations had better intelligence apparatuses than the British. They had plenty of training in taking apart dangerous organisations before they had time to flourish. They wouldn't have ruled the waves if they hadn't known something about making sure local revolutionary groups never got too big to handle. The intelligence war in Dublin and Collins' role in the broader conflict can sometimes be exaggerated. You can blame Neil Jordan for that. But there is no doubt that Collins himself was a kind of genius, Ireland's indispensable man. I try not to let it show, but it's hard not to see Collins as Ireland's great historical figure, an unusually brilliant and talented man who came along at the perfect time. As one contemporary put it, he had the entire Republic in his head. Collins' squad, who I mentioned earlier, were tasked specifically with targeting British intelligence assets in and around Dublin City. Despite the tit-for-tat style killings that typified the pre-November 1920 period, the British still managed to put together a sophisticated network of spies and informers around the city. Principal among this network was a group of spies known as the Cairo Gang, and 18 of them were identified for execution. They felt the need to act quickly as time was ever against them. Despite Collins' famously blasé attitude, reportedly jollying around Dublin on a bicycle, blustering his way through police checkpoints, the IRA knew that they were always just one wrong step away from being captured. Dick McKee, a close ally and friend of Collins, was put in charge of the operation. Information as to the agent's whereabouts was gleaned from a variety of sources, from domestic servants, from eavesdrop conversations by careless officers. I won't go into details about the individual killings. The focus of this channel is on the bigger picture, the broader themes, not the microcosm and horror of war in miniature, which it undoubtedly is. There has been some historical debate about how significant these men were. Some were indeed senior intelligence agents, others mere officers. At least one was a civilian, apparently shot in error. Whether they were the intelligence masterminds that the squad claimed or not, the impact on the British forces was severe. It would be difficult to overstate the significance of these attacks. In London, Lloyd George and his cabinet feared for their personal safety. As well they should have, as for the Minister of Defence, Cathal Brugha, had long dreamed of an operation to take out the British cabinet, this idea having been swiftly shut down by Collins. Sir Hammer Greenwood, for example, armed his entire domestic staff. Then came the reprisal on the same day. A GAA match was taking place in Crow Park, attended by about 5,000 people. It was a match between Dublin and Tipperary, for those who like to know that kind of thing. The game started a little late, at 3:15pm. One must wonder what the mood must have been like, considering that the crowd would have known about the string of killings that had taken place in the city that morning. There had been severe reprisals across the country in reaction to IRA attacks in previous months. The RIC, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries converged on the stadium from every direction. Apparently, their plan was to search every man as they left. Shots were fired around 3:25 p.m. Some Crown forces claim that they heard shots coming from the stadium itself. No historian believes this claim to be accurate, at least none that I know of. The Crown forces fired for approximately 90 seconds before they ceased firing. Not all of the 14 dead were killed by rifle fire. 2 had been stampeded in the pandemonium that followed the massacre. Unlike the Michael Collins film, there was no armoured car in the stadium itself. As the dust settled, the police conducted a search of the stadium. They found 1 revolver. In Britain itself, the attack on the intelligence officer garnered a great deal of attention, as you might imagine. Efforts to draw attention to the massacre at Croke Park was met with outrage in the House of Commons when Joe Devlin, a Northern Nationalist MP, attempted to ask a question about it. Devlin was then attacked by Major John Molson, who sounds like the most Tory man I could ever imagine. Molson grabbed Devlin by the neck and attempted to drag him down towards his bench. Devlin broke loose and threw a few skates. There were chants of kill him in Parliament. Quote, "This is a fine specimen of your English courage and chivalry, to attack one man among 600. That is most unparliamentary language." So while Dublin was living through some of its darkest days in the 20th century, something major was happening down in County Cork. As we've seen in earlier episodes, Cork was easily the most active area for the IRA. It's where the best IRA commanders were, where they were inflicting the most damage on their enemy. One of these talented local commanders was Tom Barry. The auxiliaries were an elite group of former British officers sent shortly after the Black and Tans. They had a reputation for being more efficient and better fighters than the already hated Black and Tans. The fact that not many successful operations had been carried out against them weighed heavily on the Cork IRA and Barry in particular. A strong garrison of auxiliaries were based in the town of Macroom, from where they regularly conducted raids in nearby townlands and villages. Barry's column decided to ambush them at Kilmichael, an isolated spot on the Macroom-Dunmanway road. If you read reports of the period, a lot of them involve men waiting in ditches for long periods of time and then going home, having never encountered their enemy. For all the ambushes the IRA prepared, a relatively small number of them actually led to an all-out conflict. Kilmichael would be the most significant one to date, leaving 17 auxiliaries dead and 1 wounded. 3 IRA men also lost their lives. There was a controversy in Irish historiography about this ambush that I really don't want to get into, claims of false surrender and thuggishness. For those who are interested, all I'll say is read Peter Hart's book about the IRA in Cork and then read Meada Ryan's biography of Tom Barry. I'll just add my own 2 cents here and say the Hart's account of the ambush is by now thoroughly discredited. What I find much more interesting is how an entire generation of Irish historians initially seemed to fawn over Hart's claims without properly investigating them. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and it seems like Hart's evidence wasn't sufficient for the claims he made. Indeed, I believe he even went so far as to invent anonymous sources. If anyone wants to talk about this in the comments, I'd be happy to expand on this there. You might well wonder, what is 18 casualties to the assembled might of the British Empire? And why am I calling an ambush in rural Cork a turning point in the war? I'd argue that the ambush in Kilmichael had spelled out very clearly to British forces that the IRA were not just a gang of well-organised criminals, but instead a legitimate insurgency that was evolving and growing more sophisticated over time. Martial law was declared locally in December 1920. You can also see from the immediate British reaction with reprisals in the local area, as well as the later incident in Cork which led to the burning of much of the city in the following months, that British forces were well and truly fed up and left with the sole and brutal tactic of reprisal as a countermeasure. Predictably, every single act of brutality by the paramilitary forces sent over by the British government drove local people, many of whom may not have been particularly sympathetic to the Republican cause, closer and closer to the outstretched arms of Sinn Féin and the IRA. Okay, thanks for everything. Thanks for watching. See you next month and take it easy now. Good luck.